Voltaire. Candide, or All for the Best. Are you in the mood for a globe-trotting misadventure that's as thought-provoking as it is entertaining? Then get ready for Candide, a classic satire about a hopelessly naive and terribly misfortunate young man who just can't seem to catch a break. Written in 1759 by the renowned French philosopher Voltaire, Candide arrived at the height of the Enlightenment. In this time of intense philosophical and social debate, Voltaire used the novella as a vehicle to challenge the prevailing optimistic worldview of his peers. Voltaire's sardonic view of both human nature and society, combined with his razor-sharp wit, left a lasting impression on his readers, challenging them to think more critically about questions of suffering, free will, and the nature of good and evil. This blink offers more than just a glimpse into 18th century philosophy. It will provide you with a timeless, humorous lens through which to examine your own beliefs and societal structures. All for the Best. We first meet Candide, our hero, in Westphalia, Germany, where he resides in the castle of the venerable Baron Thunder Ten Tronckh. Rumoured to be an illegitimate son of the Baron's sister, Candide lives a sheltered life among the royals, not quite respected, but well tolerated. From a young age, the good-natured boy finds himself under the tutelage of Dr. Pangloss, a professor of metaphysico-theologico-cosmologology, who espouses a doctrine of extreme optimism. He instills in Candide that all is well, as they're already living in the best of all possible worlds. Naive Candide absorbs Pangloss's every word, believing him to be the greatest philosopher of all time. Apart from the Baron and Pangloss, Candide shares the castle with the £350 Baroness and her 2 teenage children. One of these children is the beautiful but bland Cunegonde. One day, Cunegonde observes Pangloss giving a lesson in experimental natural philosophy to Paquette, one of her mother's chambermaids. Piqued by this demonstration, Cunegonde decides to try some moves on Candide, but their little romance proves short-lived. When the Baron discovers them kissing behind a curtain, he kicks Candide out of the castle. Alone in the real world, Candide's optimism is immediately put to the test. Cold and hungry, he finally arrives in the nearby town of Waldberg-Hoftraub-Dickdorf, where he meets 2 kind strangers who offer him food and drink. They turn out to be recruiters for the Bulgarian army, who end up tricking him into joining their cause. On his first day with the Bulgarian military, Candide receives 30 blows with a cudgel for his poor efforts. By his 3rd day, he receives only 10, for which his comrades begin to regard him as a prodigy. But the true horrors of his military service are only just beginning. After a brutal battle with the Tartar army, Candide finally manages to escape, stumbling over a battlefield covered in brains, arms, and legs. He runs into the arms of a kind Anabaptist named James, who graciously takes him in, cleans him, and feeds him. The next day, Candide sees a wretched beggar on the road. The poor man is covered in sores, with a half-eaten nose and rotten teeth. The beggar turns out to be his old teacher Pangloss, and he has some terrible news. The castle Thunder Ten Tronckh was stormed by Bulgarians. Everyone was slaughtered, the Baron, the Baroness, as well as their son and their beautiful daughter, Cunegonde. Pangloss himself managed to flee, but was ravaged by a horrible venereal disease he contracted from his mistress Paquette. A series of misfortunes. Candide cries terribly when he hears the news about his beloved Cunegonde. He takes the ailing Pangloss to James the Anabaptist, begging him to treat his friend. James obliges and nurses Pangloss back to health. The lucky guy loses merely 1 ear and 1 eye. James then asks Candide and Pangloss to return the favour and accompany him on a business trip to Lisbon. On board the ship to Portugal, the 3 men philosophize about the nature of good and evil. Pangloss, despite the horrors he's seen, maintains that everything is for the best. The greater the misfortune of an individual, he muses, the greater the general good. Just at that moment, the ship is caught in a horrible storm. In the chaos that ensues, good-natured James manages to rescue a sailor who nearly tumbles overboard. But when James falls in the water himself, the sailor leaves him to drown. Pangloss and Candide survive the storm, paddling into the Lisbon harbour upon a loose ship plank. But as soon as they set foot on dry land, an earthquake strikes, turning half the city to rubble. For the next few days, Candide and Pangloss rummage through the ruins, feeding off scavenged scraps. Finally, the government of Lisbon decides the best way to prevent further earthquakes is to conduct an auto da fe, a public execution of the enemies of the Spanish Inquisition. Candide and Pangloss are among those rounded up, Pangloss for philosophizing too much, and Candide for listening to him. At the auto da fe, poor Pangloss is hanged, while horrified Candide merely receives a whipping. After the ordeal, he's taken in by an old woman. Candide spends several days recovering at her house before she leads him to a mansion in the countryside. There, a wonderful surprise awaits our young hero. Inside the mansion, Candide meets his beautiful Cunegonde, alive and well, and she has her own story to tell. After being violated and stabbed by Bulgarian soldiers, she was taken in by the captain of the army as his private mistress. The captain ended up selling Cunegonde to a Jewish businessman, who took her to Lisbon. Here, the Grand Inquisitor laid eyes on her. After lengthy haggling, the Jewish man and the Grand Inquisitor decided to share the young woman, each allowed to spend half the week with her. They set her up in the remote mansion, content with their deal. It was Cunegonde who'd recognized Candide at the auto da fe and had arranged for the old woman to retrieve him. A short-lived reunion. Just as Cunegonde finishes her story, the Jewish businessman arrives at the house. When he sees Candide, he flies into a rage, hurling abuse at Cunegonde for her treachery. Candide draws his sword and, to his own horror, stabs the man to death. As he's consulting Cunegonde and the old woman about what to do with the dead body, the Grand Inquisitor arrives. Panicked, Candide draws his sword once more and again stabs a man to death. Now it's clear that Candide, Cunegonde, and the old woman have to flee. They make their way to Cadiz in Spain, not without losing all of their money on the way. In Cadiz, Candide shows his military skills to a Spanish officer, who immediately makes him commander of his troop. The troop is setting sail for Paraguay to quash a revolt of the natives. Candide doesn't think twice about joining them, taking Cunegonde and the old woman with him on board the ship. During the voyage, the old woman shares her harrowing life story. Once the Princess of Palestrina, she first witnessed the murder of her fiancé, then the violent assault of her mother, after which she was sold into slavery, surviving rape, famine, and war, finally ending up as a servant of the Jewish businessman. Arriving at the port of Buenos Aires, the travellers are greeted by the governor, a certain Don Fernando de Ibarra y Figueroa, y Mascarenes, y Lampurdos, y Sousa. The stately, arrogant governor immediately takes a liking to Cunegonde, ordering her to marry him. At the same time, Candide learns that the Inquisition has been pursuing them. Their ship is already in the harbour. The old woman advises Cunegonde to marry the rich governor to protect herself. Candide flees, taking with him a Spanish valet named Cacambo. Cacambo suggests they ride inland and join the Jesuits, who are fighting against the Spanish oppressors. But when they make it to the Jesuit leader, Candide is in for another surprise. The Jesuit commandant is none other than young Baron Thunder Ten Tronc, the handsome brother of Cunegonde. He miraculously survived the assault of the Bulgarians, making his way to Latin America. But the heartwarming reunion quickly turns sour when Candide declares his intentions to rescue and marry Cunegonde. The young baron opposes the union, striking Candide over the head. Before he knows it, Candide has stabbed yet another man. Disguised in the dead baron's clothes, Candide and Cacambo flee into the jungle. There, they survive a strange and dangerous encounter with a local tribe. After their horses die of fatigue, the intrepid duo decide to continue in a little canoe they find by a river. But they quickly lose control of the boat in the violent current, passing out as they crash into a bed of rocks. The Riches of El Dorado. When Candide and Cacambo awaken, they find themselves in paradise, the mystical city of El Dorado. Here, the streets are paved with precious stones, and even the simplest houses are made from gold and jewels. The inhabitants live in perfect harmony, guided by reason and mutual respect, rather than rigid laws or religious doctrine. They show Candide and Cacambo perfect hospitality, urging them to stay in their hidden paradise. But despite the perfection of El Dorado, Candide decides that he must return to the city to find Cunegonde. As they depart, the king gives them 100 red-wooled sheep, each laden with diamonds and precious metals, not understanding why the two men are so interested in these pebbles. Candide and Cacambo are ecstatic, believing that their new riches will solve all their problems. But once back out in the jungle, their hardships continue. They travel for weeks to reach the coast, losing several sheep along the way. Finally, they end up in the Dutch colony of Suriname. Realizing he won't be able to enter Argentina without being arrested, Candide instructs Cacambo to travel to Buenos Aires alone and bribe the governor into releasing Cunegonde. Meanwhile, Candide will travel to Venice, where he'll wait for their return. The friends part. Unfortunately, the Dutch slave owner who promises to take Candide to Europe ends up swindling him, loading Candide's riches onto his ship and then setting sail without him. Dismayed, Candide sets out to find another travel companion. He meets the cynical Martin, who also wants to travel to Europe. Martin doesn't share Candide's optimism. He's of the opinion that there's as much evil in the world as there is good. They journey to France, where, according to Martin, the three principal occupations are love, slander, and talking nonsense. In Paris, Candide is immediately swarmed by all kinds of helpful folk who recognize him as a man of means. One of them, an abbé or cleric, takes Candide to a brothel, where the head mistress talks him out of 2 of his diamonds. The abbé also writes a fake letter to Candide, convincing him that Cunegonde is already in Paris, gravely ill. When Candide tries to visit her, the abbé has him and Martin arrested by a corrupt police officer. Luckily, Candide still has enough riches to bribe the officer to let them go. After a brief detour to England, which Candide and Martin find immediately disagreeable, the pair finally reach Italy. But in Venice, disappointment awaits. Cacambo and Cunegonde are nowhere to be found. Tending the garden. Despite everything, Candide is not ready to give up his good faith. When he encounters a happy young couple on the streets of Venice, Candide makes a bet with pessimistic Martin. Candide will prove to him that some people are, in fact, very happy. Upon inviting the couple to dinner, they learn that the young woman is none other than Paquette, Pangloss's former mistress. After being driven out of the castle, Paquette was forced to prostitute herself to make a living. Her companion, a friar, is no less disillusioned with life. In a last attempt to prove that happiness is real, Candide takes Martin to visit Lord Pococurante, the richest man in town. Surely, this wealthy man has nothing to complain about. But Candide finds Pococurante totally apathetic in the face of his expensive paintings, overflowing library, and exquisite musical entertainment. His optimism takes another hit, but a miracle occurs just in time to revive it. At an inn, Candide recognizes Cacambo. His old friend explains that through a series of misfortunes, he's become enslaved to a former king. Cunegonde and the old woman are in Constantinople, serving a local prince. Candide is overjoyed to have new hope. He buys Cacambo off his master. Together with Martin, they set out to find Cunegonde. On board a galley in the Bosporus, Candide recognizes 2 of the disfigured slaves rowing the boat. It's the young Baron and Pangloss. The young Baron survived Candide's stabbing, while Pangloss was miraculously reanimated after his hanging in Lisbon. They both ended up in Constantinople, where they were arrested and enslaved. The Baron for bathing naked with a young man, Pangloss for offering flowers to a Muslim woman. Candide immediately pays the ship's captain to free the 2. He asks Pangloss if after all this hardship, the old man still believes that all is for the best. Pangloss maintains that since he's a philosopher, he cannot retract his opinion. And so, Candide, Martin, Cacambo, Pangloss, and the Baron all arrive in Constantinople to free Cunegonde and the old woman. Candide is in for a little shock, however. Formerly beautiful Cunegonde has become ugly and withered. Fancying himself a man of honor, he nevertheless pays the ransom, determined to marry her. Surprisingly, her brother, the Baron, still opposes the marriage. After some debate, the group decides to deliver him back to the galley owner. Candide uses the last of his money to buy a small farm for his wife and entourage, but a happy end fails to materialize. Cunegonde grows uglier and more combative by the day. Cacambo has to work back-breaking hours to bring in money for the estate. Pangloss feels forced to espouse a philosophy of optimism he no longer quite believes in, and the old woman is more feeble than ever. Only Martin seems content with his fate, certain that any other would be worse. The group spends their days comparing their past hardship, arguing over who's had the worst fate. Candide's former optimism is waning. But finally, an encounter with an old Turkish farmer resolves his crisis of faith. Asked how he is so content, the farmer tells Candide that he just keeps on working his farm, providing for his family. Candide vows to do the same and just keeps tending his garden. With this new philosophy, he's finally able to cultivate peace on the farm. The story of Candide is a scathing satire of philosophical optimism, particularly targeting Leibniz's theory that this is the best of all possible worlds. Voltaire uses Candide's misadventures to dismantle this notion, exposing the deep-seated flaws of such a simplistic worldview in the face of the harsh reality of human existence. Candide is faced with all kinds of suffering, both natural and man-made. From earthquakes to war, slave trade to personal cruelty, Voltaire paints a world rife with misery. This challenges one of the big religious doctrines of his time, that all human suffering is part of a divine plan. Another key theme in the novel is the critique of social and political institutions. With his sharp wit, Voltaire takes aim at the Catholic Church, European monarchies, and colonial powers. He exposes the hypocrisy, corruption, and absurdity inherent in these power structures, questioning their legitimacy. In doing so, Voltaire's not afraid to make fun of his own countrymen, portraying the Parisians as debauched, opportunistic swindlers. Throughout the novel, Voltaire emphasized the notion of practical action over abstract philosophy. Candide grows gradually more empowered throughout his journey, finally taking his fate into his own hands. He manages to save himself and free many of his friends. His developing pragmatism leads Candide to the famous conclusion that he must simply cultivate his garden. Voltaire hereby suggests that engaging productively with our immediate circumstances is more valuable than grand philosophical systems. Ultimately, Candide advocates for a middle ground between blind optimism and abject pessimism. Voltaire encourages a pragmatic approach to life that acknowledges the world's imperfections but still strives to improve one's own circumstances. Suffering is a part of life, but that doesn't mean we must accept ours without complaint. In this Blink to Candide by Voltaire, you followed the satirical misadventures of an unlucky optimist. Candide, a naive young man, is expelled from his sheltered life in a baron's castle after falling in love with the baron's daughter, Cunegonde. Thrust into a chaotic world, he encounters war, natural disasters, and human cruelty, challenging his tutor Pangloss's optimistic philosophy that this is the best of all possible worlds. Candide's journey takes him across Europe and to the Americas, where he briefly finds utopia in El Dorado, but leaves in search of his beloved Cunegonde. After numerous misadventures, reunions, and losses, Candide finally reunites with a much-changed Cunegonde and his old companions. Disillusioned but wiser, they settle on a small farm where Candide concludes that rather than philosophize about the nature of the world, we must cultivate our garden. This simple life of productive work becomes their path to contentment in an imperfect world. Okay, that's it for this Blink. We hope you enjoyed it. If you can, please take the time to leave us a rating. We always appreciate your feedback. Thanks for listening, and see you in the next Blink.